Okay, I thought I would do a little talk about the Platonic ideal in portrait painting. A couple weeks ago, I won this award in London, and it was interesting because the judges said that there was a timeless presence in the portrait. And what I was trying to do with the portrait was combine my sitter, Jean Denis, with this Platonic ideal of a person. And the idea is not that popular today. People refer to flattering the sitter. Whereas when I was studying, we didn't really call it flattering the sitter, we called it idealizing the sitter. And this has a long history in Western art, the idea that you would take somebody and make sort of an idealized version of them. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that and where it comes from and where I learned about it. I have some books here. Plato's Republic in Book 10, it's kind of where he explains the Platonic ideal. I don't know if you all remember this, but basically there's an ideal form of everything. I think the example he uses is beds and tables. I always like tables because that's the version I heard first. But so the idea is that you have this ideal table which exists outside of time and space. There's no physical ideal table. So this ideal table exists out there, created by God, and every time a carpenter makes a table, they make, no matter how beautiful the table is, they make sort of an inferior version to this perfect table. And if people stop making tables for 500 years and then somebody makes a table, tables have always existed in this sort of ideal version. It's interesting in the Republic, because after he explains this Platonic ideal with beds and tables, he kind of attacks painters, naturalistic painters. He says that, there's this ideal table, and then a carpenter makes a table that's an inferior version of the table. And then painters, when they paint a table, they're actually painting an inferior copy of an inferior copy of the ideal table. And it's interesting, Plato has sort of a complicated relationship with artists, but it's a bit ironic because in this section where he really talks about the ideal and where he is sort of negative about painters, and it's ironic because this has been probably one of the most influential passages in Western art. What happened was that artists, read this and thought, well, I'm not going to do an inferior copy of an inferior copy. I'm just going to imagine the ideal version in my head and make a copy of that. And so already in ancient Greece, you had artists like, I think it's Zeuxis, who did a Helen by taking sort of the best features of a number of different female models and combining them, making an ideal that way. I think Phidias's statue of Zeus was a famous example where he didn't copy any one person, but he imagined in his head what the ideal version of Zeus would look like, and that's where the sculpture came from. So this idea has been going on for a long time. I was first introduced to it through Reynolds in his discourses on art. And I'll actually just read to you an important section. This is at the end of Discourse 3, talks a lot about this idea through, it's funny because he doesn't actually mention Plato. He talks about it through Proclus, who was, I think he was the head of the Athenian Academy in like the 5th century or something, but it's a Platonic ideal. But let's see, here we go. This is in Discourse number 4. He's talking about the great style, which is this sort of ideal beauty. He, refers to it in the Italian and the French. But when he gets to portrait painting, he says, it may be asserted that the great style is always more or less contaminated by any meaner mixture. Now here he's referring to portraiture as a meaner mixture than history painting, I guess, would be the sort of top tier of painting, and then you go down with portrait painting, landscape, still life, etc. Continuing. But it happens in a few instances that the lower may be improved by borrowing from the grand. Thus, if a portrait painter is desirous to raise and improve his subject, he has no other means than by approaching it to a general idea. He leaves out all the minute breaks and particularities of the face, and changes the dress from a temporary fashion to one more permanent, which has annexed to it no ideas of meanness from its being familiar to us. But if an exact resemblance of an individual be considered as the sole object to be aimed at, the portrait painter will be apt to lose more than he gains by the acquired dignity taken from general nature. It is very difficult to ennoble the character of a countenance, but at the expense of the likeness, which is what is most generally required by such as sit to the painter. So there's Reynolds talking about basically this idea where you would lose little details, peculiarities. And when you think about it too, you'll often get a sitter at a certain age. Maybe they're a young child or, an old man. If you think about it, there's an interesting idea that I heard before I started this portrait. The philosopher Schopenhauer had this idea that each one of us has our own Platonic ideal. I mean, the real Platonic ideal, and again, Plato wouldn't agree with any of this, but the real Platonic ideal is just a sort of general ideal person. But Schopenhauer's idea was that and it's a more modern take on it because he's 19th century. Schopenhauer's idea was that you have each one of us has an ideal version of ourselves. And it's kind of interesting to think about, like, over the course of your life, when would you have arrived closer to that ideal? Just thinking about your own existence, and when would when would the portrait be done that described you at your best? Not just when you're able to sit because you're retired and, it's a Tuesday afternoon in January and you're tired and, it might not be your best moment, but why does that have to represent you as a person? I had a portrait commission many years ago that went badly. It was 15 years ago or so. And it was a friend of a friend, and it was, we really disagreed about what he looked like. He kept saying, that doesn't look like me. And he was, an older man in the 70s. And it got to the point where I even had another professional portrait painter come in and give me a critique with the client standing there, which was not very professional, but he just kept saying, that's not what I look like. Finally, I said to him, can you bring me a photograph of what you look like? And he brought me a photo from like 30 years earlier or something. He was on a beach in Sardinia. It was this little sort of brown smudge with the blue water behind him. And at the time, I remember thinking it was a bit ridiculous. That's not what he looks like. But that was, like I say, 15 years ago. And over the course of the years, it's sort of stuck in my head. And I've come to think that maybe he was right. Like I should have, in a way, I should have been on that beach in the 70s in Sardinia. Somebody, he should have had his portrait painted that day. So that was his sort of the closest he ever arrived at his ideal self. And that's, if he's now passed away, like that should have been what captured him. So that's kind of the foundation of this idea of idealizing your sitter. And again, it's not that you're flattering them or you're just trying to make them happy. You're really trying to capture their essence and, merge that with the person that is sitting in front of you and try to describe in paint the best version of themselves. And you can do this, with the client, and you each decide. It can be entirely the artist who decides. Another thing that's interesting is some people think that, well, then you're always going to paint them really young, but it's not necessarily true. Sometimes I've definitely painted people where if you saw photos of them when they were younger and you saw them the way they were when they were older, they've sort of grown into their ideal self. In a way, they're more picturesque when they were older. So anyways, those are some ideas on the Platonic ideal in portrait painting, and something to think about. I'll actually do another little story about this painting again. It's funny because I tend to talk about gadgets and technology and stuff in my videos, and it's true that I personally, I've always been interested in this sort of philosophical and spiritual aspect to painting. I personally come from a very materialistic, scientific, rational background, and I have, I can't see somebody's soul when I look at them. But another interesting Platonic, late Platonic or Neoplatonic, if you prefer, idea that went into this portrait was, I was doing this to test the light in my studio. One issue I have is this skylight. So if I look up, you probably get highlights in my eyes. But because of this highlight source, it's higher than I'm used to, my eyes are in shadow. And as a portrait painter, you're supposed to paint the soul of your sitter or capture the soul in the painting. But we're also told the soul is inside the body, and the eyes are the window to the soul. So what do you do if your light source is too high and you can't see the soul of your sitter? Just before I started the portrait of John Denis, I was reading a book completely unrelated to painting or philosophy. It was actually about wood carving. But he mentioned a line by Plotinus, I think he was 2nd, 3rd century Neoplatonic philosopher. And he said that the soul is not in the body at all, that the body sits in the soul like a net in the sea. And I thought it was a very beautiful image, this idea of our bodies, in our souls, with the soul sort of, all around us. And like I say, I can't see souls, but it's an interesting approach to portrait painting. I'm also humble enough to admit that there's a ton going on that I don't understand when I'm painting. You have strong inspiration or emotional attachment to the light, and there's, we're definitely not completely aware of everything that's happening. But if you think of the soul as being outside the body, then you can paint it without needing the eyes. The eyes don't have to do all the heavy lifting in the portrait. So I thought that was an interesting idea that I had read when I was working on the portrait of Jean Denis. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a bit different than usual, but thanks for watching.